Welcome to our panel on the Israel-Hamas war in Gaza. I'm Andrew Parasiliti, president of Monitor. I'd like to begin by first thanking Dr. Ebtissam El-Ketbi, my friend and colleague. You've done an amazing job with the Abu Dhabi strategic debate. It gets better every year. It's to your credit and your amazing team's credit, so thank you again for having us today. Our panel is about the war. It's claimed more than 11,000 Palestinian lives so far, mostly women and children, as Israel continues its air and ground assault to destroy Hamas. More than 1,200 Israelis have also been killed as a result of the October 7th Hamas terrorist attack. I'd like to begin with just a few observations, questions as we begin the discussion, which we'll be getting into today with the esteemed panel. The first is a question about the issue of a ceasefire. U.S. President Joe Biden said last week, and I'm quoting him, "There is no possibility of a ceasefire." This puts the United States as an outlier in what seems to be a fairly broad international consensus for an immediate ceasefire. We saw this at the Arab and Islamic Summit convened in Riyadh on Saturday. But can that change? Will it change? This has happened in the past. It happened during the 1983-84 conflict in Lebanon. It happened during the George W. Bush administration as well, especially with the scenes of atrocities that we're seeing in Lebanon. Secretary of State Blinken said just a day or so after Biden made that statement, far too many Palestinians have died. Our Monitor columnist Ben Caspit writes that Israel fears what he calls a rearguard action diplomatically by the Biden administration, putting pressure on Israel as a result of the Americans feeling this pressure for a ceasefire. Second, I'm going to mention a column I wrote this week in Monitor. It was titled, "This is Not Your Parents' Israeli-Palestinian Conflict." For most non-Palestinian Arabs and Muslims under 35, before October 7th, the Palestinian issue, it seems to me, had a kind of Star-Spangled Banner feel. And I hope this analogy is not too strained given we'll get beyond my American colleagues here. All agreed and said or sang the words, it's an important thing, but the intimacy of the context and the emotional impact may have been lost compared to other generations in previous decades. Well, if that was the case on the Palestinian issue, it's no longer the case. This generation is now connected and engaged. They are seeing what's happening live every day, and the connections are, this is a global issue. This cohort, youth cohort, is now connected to much of the global South, as well as those in the East and the West who share in the outrage regarding the Israeli actions and the toll it's taken in Gaza. Third, the panel will get into some of the thinking and complexities regarding the post-conflict situation. This is, of course, very hard to do. We don't know how the conflict ends, when it ends, who else may be involved in the conflict when it ends, but we're going to take a shot at it. My hunch, and again with all caveats, I think that the U.S. has a major leadership role here, and the U.S. needs to go big and bold. People are talking about comparisons to a '91 Madrid conference. At the core, in my view, needs to be a vision of integration, regional integration for Israel, Palestine, and the region more broadly. The pieces are there, as Dr. Gargash said earlier today. One should not give up on those trends and patterns and policies that led to that period of de-escalation and progress. Some may seem to be pushed aside, but not necessarily and not forever. The Abraham Accords, the progress in Iraq, Jordan, Egypt cooperation, the advanced talks between Saudi Arabia and the Palestinians in the context of Israel-Saudi normalization. This is all very real and very current, and we can come back to. And Gaza, for its part, in a post-war situation, needs integration, not isolation. So many of the plans post-war talk about sealing off the Gaza Strip. That's not the way we need to think if we're going to think big. Fourth, we're going to talk about the future of Hamas. Is defeating Hamas possible? What is the role of Hamas in the future? Again, all difficult to assess. Our U.S. and Israeli calls for the defeat of Hamas and its destruction, a view shared by many in the region and probably many in Gaza as well. But are they realistic, and in what cost? Salam Fayyad, Mohammed Dahlan, to name two former Palestinian officials who are not Hamas advocates or officials, have been saying there's a role for Hamas in some form. Ehud Barak says Hamas can't be destroyed. Hamas and its progeny will thrive in the death, despair, and poor governance in Gaza. And that situation, the miserable situation that was Gaza before this war, has got unbearably worse. Recall that Al-Qaeda begat ISIS in the wake of the failed governance and security situation in Iraq after the fall of Saddam Hussein. And fifth and finally, we got to talk about Iran. Iran thinks it's winning. You saw President Raisi at the summit in his kafia. Iran and its proxies and allies, Hamas, Hezbollah, the armed groups in Iraq, Yemen, and Syria, have shown their disruptive power. The nuclear talks have been ended before October 7th. Can Iran be part of the conversation about post-conflict regional security? Should it be? Anyway, these are questions for the panel. Let me just briefly introduce our panelists, and we'll get right into the conversation. You can see their full bios in the program materials. I'll just go Dr. Jim Lindsay of the Council on Foreign Relations, Dr. Andrey Kortunov of the Russian International Affairs Council, Dr. Zaid Eyadat of the University of Jordan, Ambassador Karim Haggag of the American University of Cairo, Dr. Randa of the Middle East Institute. Welcome to everybody. Let's get right into it. I'm going to start with Zaid. We saw the gathering in Riyadh, the incredible degree of consensus of the Arab and Islamic countries for a ceasefire. Is there anything in those statements or anticipated next steps that you see as having a real impact on the conflict? And if you could also just say a word about how you see the regional diplomatic situation and the balance between governments and their peoples as the war continues.
Thank you, Andrew, and good afternoon, everyone. First, let me start by, again, thanking Dr. Abdesam, APC, and congratulations on the 10th anniversary. Well, Andrew, I'm not sure if I'm the right person to talk about diplomatic efforts in the region. I describe myself as being a rational realist. So diplomatic efforts is of not too much significance. And to answer your question directly, I think the outcomes of the summit were not surprising to anyone who's not placing much expectations of the gathering. And you know, the words or the terms been used, this is a huge gathering with no teeth. I think it's accurate because we know people sitting there, meeting there, while they're having their own differences about the situation, their relations to the situations, and their direct interest with the conflict and the war on Gaza. But before even elaborating more on that, allow me to mention some few remarks, some points to frame my interventions and make sense of the regional and global implication of the war. So I start by saying this is not a war in Gaza. It started in Gaza, but it is going beyond Gaza for sure. And by that, I'm not saying there is a regional war or a regional escalation. The possibility is there, but I'm saying this is not about Gaza. It is beyond. So there is a grand strategy. And with that, I see this as a strategic game changer in the region, and we have to take it as such. And I invite you to rethink the logic of strategic action and interaction of states and players to understand why the Americans, with their all weapons and deterrence, are coming to the region. The Israelis using ultimate force. So it is in Gaza, but it's not limited to Gaza. I think its regional implications already are regional, to say the least. Second, I can say now we're dealing with Gaza after Hamas. And this is directly to the question of whether Hamas can be destroyed, defeated, or not. I think we're dealing today with Gaza after Hamas. Well, much to be added to that and elaborated, and I'll be happy to provide logical reasoning of why I think that. If to localize the war, I think there is also a war of and over narratives, of and over perceptions, and of and over existential concerns. And this is important also to buy it in the analysis. And that makes it a zero-sum game. And that's why it's dangerous. Of course, the war is the ultimate testimony of the moral failure of the international world order, the liberal rule-based world order. It's a huge moral failure for all kind of things. Double standards, moral failure, you name it what you want, but this is a very important thing. And why I'm saying that, because it says strategic outcomes and repercussions that has to do and to contribute to the radicalization trends that will be taking place maybe in the region, because the world is seeing how the double standards is applied and how, yes, again, one more time, some lives are less important than other lives. And this is became like, everyone is internalized that our life worthless. And why that's the case. Now, if you contextualize it in the region, I say there are, before the war, just before October 7th, the region was going through conflicting, competing kind of trends, trajectories. You, Andrew, refer to some of them, but let's get the bigger picture. I think the region was about to brought to more integrated kind of relations. This economic corridor, India, Middle East, and Europe is a major step built on the Abraham Accord as also a main cornerstone in this regional integration. So, and this is within the American, rethinking of the region, its global competitions, and within the regional powers, especially rising middle powers in the region, trying also to repositioning themselves. It was much more predictable that the region is actually moving to more integrated kind of stances. Well, on the other side, of course, there have been worsening, and this is the other trend, I'll finish in 1 minute, worsening pre-Arab Risings conditions, socioeconomic issues, declining democracy and human rights, and etc. And therefore, there have been competitions between potential winners and losers. And I think what had happened has upset the formula, the trajectories, the trend. Losers, possible losers could be Russia, China, Iran, Hezbollah, Hamas, and others. And therefore, I think what we're seeing, including the meetings, Arab summits, and the OIC summits, is all about to restore the trends that was calling for more regional integration and stability than what we've seen in the October 7. I'll stop here.
Karim, let's pick that up. I want to come back to the question I asked Zaid. What do you see as coming out of the summit with regard to diplomatic initiatives here in the region that could have an impact on the conflict? How do you see the effect of the war in the coming weeks or months in terms of the relationship between the governments and its people? How is this war playing out? You can comment on the situation, of course, in Egypt, but even more broadly.
Thank you, Andrew. Let me just start by adding my word of appreciation to Dr. El-Kidbi for the kind invitation to participate, and my congratulations on a very successful 10th edition of this gathering. So I think the point of departure should be an assessment of what is happening in Gaza. So if we look at all of the previous rounds of confrontation between Israel and Hamas in Gaza since Hamas took over in 2007, we find that all of them have resulted in a return to the status quo ante. So Hamas is firmly entrenched in Gaza. The standoff between Hamas and Israel continues. The division between Gaza and the West Bank also continues. Now, the Israelis have told us that this time will be different. They have told us that there can be no going back to the status quo ante, in that the explicit objective now is to bring about the destruction of Hamas. I think the Israelis are partially right. I think there is going to emerge a new reality in Gaza, but not in the way that the Israelis expect. So what is happening in Gaza? Israel is imposing a new reality on the ground in Gaza. It is dividing Gaza between north and south. It is deliberately depopulating northern Gaza, in effect bringing about or inflicting another Nakba on the Palestinians. This, by the way, is my own formulation, but it's also the formulation, the explicit formulation of Israeli cabinet ministers. Israel talks about imposing a new security control over Gaza after this conflict is over. It also talks about not being responsible for life in Gaza, so Israel is not responsible for food, electricity, water, work permits, travel permits to and from Gaza. And Israel has ruled out the option of the Palestinian Authority coming into Gaza, which of course leaves a very big question as to who will take over governance and services in Gaza. So Israel is imposing a new reality on the ground. However, Hamas dominates the narrative coming out of the conflict. I think the harsh reality that we need to face is that the conflict has validated Hamas's narrative of resistance. If we look at Israel's definition of victory in this conflict, it's all about destroying Hamas. Well, what does that mean? There are all sorts of qualifications as to whether this means ending Hamas's governance in Gaza, eroding Hamas's military infrastructure. It's complicated. Hamas has a very simple definition of victory. It needs to survive in order to emerge victorious from this conflict. And so I think Hamas emerges in a position in which it is able to dominate the narrative coming out of this conflict. So that is the harsh reality we are facing now in Gaza. And that has implications, as I think Zaid said, beyond Gaza. That has implications certainly for Egypt. I think the spillover effects of this conflict with regards to Egypt are quite considerable. The humanitarian pressures, the demographic pressures, the security pressures, all of them face Egypt with difficult challenges as to how to deal with the post-Gaza situation. It has very important implications, I think, for the intra-Palestinian space, and that means the West Bank, in a situation in which the Palestinian Authority is considerably weakened and in which the daily tensions in the West Bank are rising. And that, of course, has implications for Jordan. It certainly has implications regionally. I think we've seen how this current conflict is having very serious implications for what is a fragile balance of deterrence between Israel and the United States on the one hand, and the axis of resistance on the other hand. And the situation in which both sides are testing the other's red lines in a way that could be quite volatile. And it also vindicates, I think, Iran's narrative of bringing about this idea of the unity of the fronts, right? That now Palestine, both in the West Bank and in Gaza, and to a certain extent in Israel proper, these are all part of one extended arena of confrontation between Iran on the one hand and Israel and the United States on the other hand. These are the harsh realities that we will have to confront after this war is over. However it's over, however long it takes for this conflict to end, these are the very difficult challenges I think we will all have to contend with in a regional context that is changing. We've heard talk about the erosion of US credibility. We are seeing now the rise in regional tensions as a result of this conflict. It puts the Palestinian issue not only at the center of regional politics, but also, as I think you rightly mentioned, the global polarization that this is causing, I think, presents us with a new reality. And it's ironic, and I will close just with this very simple observation that I think frames the situation we're facing. Gaza is an enclave, right? It is 60 kilometers by 13 kilometers, 60 kilometers long by 13 kilometers wide. That enclave is bringing the Middle East almost to the brink of war, hopefully one that we can avoid, but that really puts a premium on dealing with these harsh realities that will face all of us coming out of this conflict.
Randa, we've had a few comments now. Karim said it, I said it, about Iran and the so-called resistance front. Tell us how you see where they're at in terms of this conflict. Is Iran correct in that it believes it's winning? And tell us a little about Hezbollah, how they're playing it, and what you think they do next.
Thank you very much. First, I would like to thank Dr. Al-Kidbi for her invitation. Congratulations on the 10th anniversary. And as an Arab woman, you make us all proud, Dr. Al-Kidbi. Thank you very much. Building on what my colleagues have said here, if we look at the Hezbollah-Israel front today, it is an active front. More than 70 fighters from Hezbollah have died to date. A number of civilians, up to 10, from the Lebanese side. On the Israeli side, you had about 23 between fighters, soldiers, and civilians also have died. But the way Hezbollah is approaching it, they are not interested in an all-out war, but they are interested in being in this fight and in staying in this fight. Their cost-benefit calculus about an all-out war is not in their favor. Their cost-benefit calculus about being in the fight according to certain rules of the game is in their benefit. What are those rules of the game? Incremental escalation, as we have seen since October 8th, in terms of their behavior on the front, and proportional escalation. A civilian target is hit by Israel, a civilian target is hit by Hezbollah in Israel. So, and whether they can maintain these rules of the game is questionable. Partly because you cannot divorce the Lebanon-Israel or Hezbollah-Israel front from the wider resistance of access engagement in the war. As Andrew has said, this war has basically brought the resistance axis to a different phase of operation. If we go back to how this axis was formed and under whose tutelage it was formed, it was basically part of Iran's forward defense strategy, mainly aimed at protecting the Iranian regime from Israel and from the United States. But at the same time, it's an axis that is basically raison d'etre, is fighting Israel and the United States for the Palestinian cause. It started as a loose coalition of actors that have overlapping interests in the beginning. And during the Syria civil war, after the Mosul war, the ISIS takeover of Mosul, and now this loose coalition of actors has become a well-integrated alliance that's very much ideologically loyal to Iran, but at the same time that is rooted in the context of a Palestinian resistance and a Palestinian cause and conditions on the ground that give the raison d'etre, new life, as this war has done. Now, are there risks of a regional war? I mean, all-out war? Yes, there are risks of all-out war. One scenario, for example, that keeps me awake at night is if a hit by one of these missiles lobbed by any actor of the resistance axis against a US asset leads to a loss of 20, 30, 40, lives of American service members. What will be the reaction of the United States? What will be the reaction of Israel? But mostly, what will be the reaction of the United States? So far, we have been fortunate that none of these missiles that have hit US bases in western Iraq, in northern Iraq, in northern East Syria, have led to death among US service members. What if that happens? What if that scenario? Is that going to be an escalation? Are we going to see, US Air Force carriers engaging in the fight? Now, in terms of victory, what does victory mean for Hezbollah? What does victory mean for Hamas? What does victory mean for the resistance axis? I think victory, Nasrallah said it in his first speech on November 3, and then I think again phrased it on November 11. What matters for them is winning by points and not by a knockout. And by winning by points, what they have achieved to date, Hezbollah has reclaimed the resistance narrative that it has lost in its involvement in Syria. It has moved over, since October 7, from being a Shia militia that has killed Sunni civilians in Syria to being again a leader of a resistance axis against Israel in a fight which has claimed thousands of lives of Palestinian civilians, including children. That reclaiming of that narrative by Hezbollah has implications for Hezbollah's roles going forward, not only within the resistance of Axis, not only inside Lebanon, but also within the region itself. And then the second line of victory, I think, that they are looking at, building on what Karim has said and what Hamas looks at that, is survival. If Hamas is able to survive, and if the resistance axis is able to deny Israel its objective of destroying Hamas, which militarily is going to be very, very hard to do, and if Hamas is able to reconstitute itself as a player, reconstitute itself in Gaza, govern Gaza, then that's something that's a point for them in the win. And then the last point in this definition of victory is what's going to be the resistance axis going forward. Very much building on what Karim said. I think the Iran narrative has won the day. Hamas narrative of using force and military resistance versus the PA narrative of negotiations, recourse to international law, recourse to multilateral institutions, negotiations. I think Hamas narrative, Hezbollah's narrative, Iran's narrative has won the day. So what are the implications for conflict resolution going forward? What are the implications for peace building in the region? What are the implications for what the previous panel has said, sustaining the de-escalation momentum that has basically prioritized diplomacy, negotiation, building walls, building bridges between different opponents going forward?
Thank you. Jim, let's turn to U.S. policy for a minute. Tell us, how you see how the politics and policy challenges facing the Biden administration are playing out, will likely play out. One, how responsive do you see the Biden administration being to the calls for a ceasefire? And secondly, how concerned are you about these risks of escalation that Randa just mentioned and how that could play out? We've got a lot of firepower now in the region.
Excellent questions, Andrew. Very tough questions. Before I get to them, like my fellow panelists, I want to thank Dr. Ebtisam and recognize the great work she has done in building the Abu Dhabi Strategic Dialogue. It is a great honor to be asked here to speak, so shukran. I would make 3 points, Andrew. And the first is I would sort of step back and try to think about what it is that the Biden administration was trying to accomplish when it came to office. Its sort of foreign policy priority was to try to concentrate American foreign policy on the challenge posed by the rise of China. That was going to be foreign policy job one. Of course, in February of 2022, that effort was complicated by the Russian invasion of Ukraine. But the administration at least sort of told itself that the rest of the world was relatively calm. That's the source of Jake Sullivan, the National Security Advisor's much commented upon point that we haven't seen the Middle East so peaceful in more than 2 decades. But again, on October 7th, that has really disrupted the Biden administration's foreign policy. It recognizes first and foremost that it has an immediate crisis on its hand that it has to deal with. But President Biden and his advisors also understand that this crisis over the conflict in Gaza is greatly complicating its effort on the first 2 foreign policy challenge it faces. It understands that these cannot be compartmentalized or detached. Second point that I would make is that the Biden administration essentially is trying to reconcile 2 competing impulses on 2 dimensions. To borrow an American idiom, the Biden administration is trying to square a circle. In terms of its policy toward Israel, the Biden administration is both seeking to embrace Israel, but also to constrain it. It is embracing Israel, as past presidents and administrations have done, because it recognizes the barbarity of what happened on October 7th, that Israel, like any other sovereign country, has the right of reprisal, because the United States agrees that it is important to degrade and destroy, insofar as is possible, the military infrastructure of Hamas. I would imagine this is also a view shared by many Arab governments in the region because of Hamas's Islamist ideology and its ties with Iran. But the Biden administration also is hoping to constrain the Israelis in terms of the scale and the method of Israel's retaliation. I think that's the way to understand President Biden's very public support for Israel, making it very clear that the United States stands with Israel. I think because he was hoping that in private it would create a sense of obligation in space in which the Israelis would be willing to take on board American advice to be very careful particularly when it comes to civilian casualties in Gaza. And you've seen the administration repeatedly make reference to America's own mistakes in the aftermath of the September 9 attacks and being indifferent to how its actions are being perceived and how some policy decisions may make sense in the short term, but provided long-term pain. And I think the administration is perhaps a bit frustrated that it is not getting as much response from Israel as it wishes. Again, it is easier to tell people that they should learn from your mistakes than it is to persuade them to actually learn from your mistakes. And I would say the second sort of set of competing impulses the Biden administration is trying to reconcile is between deterring Iran and its proxies and provoking Iran and its proxies. And here I think Randa put her finger on exactly the great danger we have. There's a temptation to think that events are controlled by governments, and particularly by powerful governments. Yet it's not too difficult to imagine the scenario that Randa pointed to, where a substantial number of American servicemen and contractors are killed in Syria, and that leads to a dynamic that may take the administration, may also take the Iranians and their proxies to a position they had not anticipated. I will just remind people that when Archduke Ferdinand was assassinated on June 28, 1914, no one in Europe thought that was going to lead to a war across Europe 5 weeks later. So I think a sense of humility about how events can get out of control are important to keep in mind. Third point is that the Biden administration is going to feel and is feeling more and more pressure both abroad and at home to do something about the death and destruction that is being inflicted upon the civilian population of Gaza. And I think in this respect, it's important to recognize that while the Israel-Hamas war of today has echoes in the past, we can point to, you mentioned 1984, 2006, those were conflicts that took place before the advent of social media. This is our first Arab-Israeli war with social media, and I think if you go out and look at social media, what it is doing, it is focusing people on the very real human costs of war. Human costs that have always been there, but in the past were much more easy to ignore. And so I think it is really sort of concentrating the mind, and it is creating greater pressures, not only Arab governments in the Middle East to respond to the resentment and anger that their publics feel, but we're seeing the same thing happen in the United States. I will note a recent poll came out last week showed that 40% of Americans, 58% of Democrats thought that Israel had gone too far in its retaliation. That compares with just 38% that said Israel's retaliation was just about right. But here we again, and you alluded to politics, get into a political fact hanging over all of this, is that the United States is now less than a year out from a presidential election. And one of the things that is very clear in the polling data is that Democrats are much more concerned about the death and destruction that is happening in Gaza than Republicans are. Republicans are much more likely to say that Israel's not doing enough to go after Hamas. And I think that is going to be one of the issues that sort of plays out going forward. I just want to conclude, Andrew, by getting back to your point on going big and bold. I think you're exactly right that it is hard to imagine that the next step in Gaza, when we can get to a point of talking about next step, that it's going to be solved with incremental change. There is going to need to be some vision, some bold plan that provides not just hope to Palestinians, but also persuades Arab governments to want to actually put something on the line. I don't see anyone articulating that vision quite yet. And my great concern is that for all of the renewed enthusiasm for the two-state solution for Palestine, I'm not so sure that that is where Israeli politics is going. And I think for Israelis who are, again, understandably still sort of in an October 8 moment, something any American can understand from September 11th, what that means is it's much more likely people are going to want to sort of push the problem away and try to securitize it rather than to embrace, talk about peaceful diplomatic solutions. And I'll stop there.
And I just remind our audience, we're already at 1:11, about 1:15, we're going to go to questions from the audience, so get in the queue. So we're going to try to stay on time in this session. Andrey, I want to come to you as well. One thing that struck me in the Russian position so far, which you're best placed to explain, President Putin used to have a good relationship with Israel and a very good relationship with Prime Minister Netanyahu. But since the war broke out, he seems to have mostly ditched that and gone all in with Hamas and the calls for the ceasefire and so forth. Tell us how you see that evolution of the position.
Well, thank you, Chair. But before doing that, I would like to echo all my fellow co-panelists in thanking the Emirates Policy Center for its kind invitation to take part in this exceptional gathering of great minds, and also in congratulating the center with the 10th anniversary. As a person who spent some time with the think tanks community, I can testify that if you survive for the first, over the first 10 years, the odds are that you'll be there to stay for a long time. So we wish you well, and please keep doing the great job that you have been doing so far. I think this is really important, not only for the region, but for us who are related to the region directly or indirectly. Let me start with saying that there is a perception in Russia, but also abroad, that the Kremlin is one of the indirect beneficiaries of the conflict. And there are at least 3 lines of logic behind this narrative. And clearly, it's not only about Palestine and Israel, it's about Ukraine, it's about the United States, and it's about the global South. So the first line is that this conflict will inevitably create a competition between Israel and Ukraine, competition for military support coming from the West and in particular from the United States, competition for financial assistance, and competition for political attention. So in the end of the day, that might somehow accelerate the Ukrainian fatigue and shift the priorities in Washington, D.C. towards the Middle East region. The second argument is that this conflict might create additional points of vulnerability for the United States beyond Israel and Palestine. Specifically, as it has been mentioned by Randa, the US servicemen in Syria and in Iraq might be in jeopardy. And just yesterday we heard that allegedly there were some casualties already inflicted upon the US military presence. This information has not been confirmed by Pentagon, but still, of course, this is something that might be a part of the Kremlin's calculus, because if the United States continues to escalate its presence in the Ukrainian conflict, Russia might reciprocate in kind by enhancing its assistance with countries like Iran and Syria and creating additional challenges for the US military presence there. And finally, the third line is that this conflict allegedly exposes the Western hypocrisy when the West applies one set of rules to Russia and a very different set of rules to Israel. Those collateral civilian casualties can be compared in these 2 cases. So all these arguments notwithstanding, I would still like to draw your attention to some caveats. that we have to keep in mind. First of all, I don't think that there is a direct competition between Ukraine and Israel in terms of US military assistance, because Israel needs different types of military hardware. It doesn't need Abrams tanks, it doesn't need Bradleys, it doesn't need F-16s, it has a robust military industry, and what it needs is high-precision systems like smart bombs, for example, which is not something that Washington delivers to Ukraine, at least right now. So it's a question to what extent the engagement of the United States with Israel might create problems for its support of Ukraine. And if the Ukraine fatigue is to grow, I think it will be caused primarily by domestic political dynamics in the United States rather than by the US engagement in this conflict. Second, of course, the United States might be exposed to additional challenges in the region, but it is yet to be seen how the United States manages or mismanages its engagement. The US influence might go down, but under a certain set of circumstances, it might also go up. So it would be at least premature to argue that the United States is on decline in its influence in the region due to this particular conflict. But most importantly, and this is the question that you raised, I think that Russia will have to pay a high toll in terms of its relations with Israel. And Israel is not just another country for Russia. There is a large Russian community in Israel. Israel did not subscribe to Western sanctions against Russia, and Israel has remained as one of the windows for Russia in terms especially of high-tech cooperation with foreign partners. And indeed, you know, this special relationship between the two leaders is not something that can be easily abandoned. But I would put it into a broader framework. I think that it's also about what we always believe to be one of the most important comparative advantages of Russia in the region. Namely, the ability of the Kremlin to have good relations with all sides of the conflicts, with Iranians and Arabs, with Shia and Sunnis, with Kurds and Turks, and of course with Israelis and Palestinians. It has always been a very delicate balance. I think there were some problems with maintaining, but these problems will definitely grow over time. If the deterioration of the Russian-Israeli relationship is likely to become long-term deterioration, definitely it would limit the scope of maneuvering for the Kremlin in the region, and definitely it will contribute to the future polarization of the region and potentially to marginalization of the Russian role in the Middle East. We're not yet there, but the challenge is clear, and this is something that has to be confronted. So I would like to conclude that though in terms of tactics, there might be losers and winners in this conflict, and Russia might gain something in the nearest future, but strategically, I think that all of us are likely to lose, especially if the conflict becomes a protracted and bloody and devastating war, which might expand beyond the Gaza Strip today. Thank you.
Great. I'd like to have one more round. We've got a little extra time before I get into the questions. I asked my panelists, again, the very brief answers this time around so we can bring the audience in. And Randa, I'd like to begin with you on this round. You've done a lot of work in post-conflict situations when you're thinking through some of the scenarios about, with all the caveats and all the things we've discussed, how it ends, who's involved, and so forth. What are the lessons learned that you've experienced in your work in these situations that you would like to see happen for a successful post-conflict scenario? And what are you most worried about for the post-war situation?
I mean, all research about counterinsurgency, counterterrorism campaigns speak about the importance of long-term planning for the post-conflict. And I'm not seeing that happening on the Israeli side. What you are seeing, or on the other, on the regional side as well. I mean, what you are seeing on the Israeli side are contradictory statements about who's going to govern Gaza, what kind of security, will be put in place, who's going to ensure food, who's going to ensure, and the talk that we are hearing from some elements of the war cabinet, particularly agriculture minister, former Shin Bet director, when he says, how this will end, going back, to Petraeus' famous statement, tell me how this ends. I mean, what this minister has been saying, it's Nakba 2023. This is how this will end. Basically, displacement of people from northern Gaza permanently, return of settlers, to Gaza, and Israel assuming security of Gaza. I mean, under this scenario, it's only normal or natural to expect there will be a continuation of the conflict for a very long time, and it will be an insurgency that's going to be led by Hamas, Islamic Jihad, against the Israeli presence that is governing an alienated population, of Palestinian or whoever is left of Gaza. So the long-term planning that needs to happen about the post-conflict settlement is not happening, partly because there are so many factors determining when this will end, how this will end. Second, I think there is a hopeful scenario of a transitional period where you have a peacekeeping force coming in, assuming, security within a regional arrangement that pushes forward a serious negotiation process between the Israelis and the Palestinians going forward. But that means acceptance by Israel and by the international community of Hamas having a seat at the table. Hamas is today, whether we like it or not, the voice of the Palestinians. And as more and more destruction takes place, as more and more killings, and as Hamas survives, as Karim said, survives, doesn't have to win, Hamas will be a big representative, if not the representative of the Palestinian. I don't see going forward any acceptance or any interest, willingness, either by the Israelis or by the international community. But also, I don't see Hamas having made the transition into seeing its objective as being part of the negotiation process and part of a two-state solution. I mean, the objective today remains the destruction of Israel. So unless you have these changes, both on the Israeli side in how they approach the other side, how they approach negotiations, and on the Palestinian side, particularly Hamas, about Israel, I think we are going to be stuck in the future in a very, very dark scenario of a Gaza Strip that is going to be marred by a sustained insurgency, poor, alienated population that will basically start, affecting the region. For example, I can see also a scenario where South Lebanon basically goes back to what was the case before 1982. And South Lebanon becomes a platform for Hamas, for Islamic Jihad, for Hezbollah to work together, maintaining, continuous attacks, a war of attrition that can be sustained for the long term. I'll stop here.
Zaid, pick up on that if you would please. Is it your view that the post-war situation is potentially that dark scenario, or what have you been picking up in terms of regional conversations about how the region envisions what can happen and what are the possibilities?
Sure, Andrew. Well, look, it's very complex. And, if you look at its static aspect of it, you can move pieces by your hands saying this will happen, this likely will, this will likely not. But it's very complex, very dynamics. However, there are different few levels. One within Hamas itself, what are the possibilities for Hamas? And I'm going to reaffirm it. Then we're talking about beyond Hamas. We already have 3 Hamases. We already have 3 Hamas, split Hamas. And they're going to be different kind of Hamas. And second, within the PA. And the third is with the PLO. And this is the new scenario has been proposed by Salam Fayyad and others, bring back PLO. And in fact, the summit you asked me about, the Arab Summit, is proposing PLO to be strengthened and come back to the table. And within the Israelis' politics as well, whether we're talking about beyond Netanyahu, after Netanyahu, or more of a radical Israelis' politics, or moving to the center, right center, something like that. And the issue of forced migration, I think is the nightmare for everyone. Every other thing can be dealt with, but this is the real Nakba. This is what is qualified as a Nakba. Whether in the West Bank, to Jordan, and settlers. I mean, everyone's been warning about what the settlers are doing in a very harsh terminology, because that's the real threat. And this is what actually, to what extent, even Jordan's king been warning of separating Gaza from the West Bank. It seems there are plans of separating that. This is the Palestinian issue. This is the issue of Palestinian state. Gaza, West Bank is part of Israel. Yehuda was Samira. And this is kind of thinking. So that is also something in there. So I leave that all, and I say there are potential good outcomes. And I can think of Madrid 2 and Oslo 2. And, it seems to me this is a more highly likely of an option to happen. The outcome, the end game of that would be bringing Israel to the integration in the region, rebuilding with the Abraham Accord. Saudi Israelis continue their normalization process, and that regional trends continues. However, maybe the downside of that, they're going to something be created called Palestinian state, but doesn't mean a Palestinian state in terms of borders, in terms of sovereignty, in terms of everything else. So, and I think the language also is used to create something and call it Palestine. And this is a Palestinian state representing Palestinians. This is not going to end the situation, but I think given the power, the balance of power existing, this is a possible scenario to happen. Now, there is an ugly scenario. It's a more radicalizing trends in the region. I mean, if this to continue, if there is no Oslo or Madrid 2, version 2 of each, and if this situation is to deteriorate more and more, I think this is very clear signals to all radical groups that violence pays off. And be patient and you'll be rewarded. Taliban, now Hamas, then Hezbollah, and then Jabhat al-Nusra in Syria, and everywhere. This is a nightmare. This is another recipe for a third or fourth version of Arab Spring and uprisings. I'll stop here.
Good. Again, very quickly, and then I've got to turn to the questions. Let me go to Jim. Briefly, we've talked about an Oslo 2, Madrid 2, some of the discussions regarding this post-war situation. You said you agreed that the Biden administration should go big. Is the Biden administration ready to go big in a post-war situation? I mean, as you started from, they had hoped to deal with different issues, and now we're back to one that they hadn't quite focused on, although they were quite focused on the Middle East, to be fair. But how do you see that ability to do a Madrid or an Oslo too?
With all due respect, Andrew, it seems like you're asking me to square a circle.
Okay.
You've asked a very complicated question, and you've asked me to answer it very, very quickly. And I guess what I would say is that I'm sure there are people in the Biden administration right now trying to think about what comes next. But I think the principals have their hands filled right now with just trying to manage the ongoing crisis. And I think the challenge they face in trying to sort of figure out the next step is to go back where we began. It is not clear when this conflict is going to end or how it is going to end. I do believe that the United States believes that a ceasefire at this point would be premature and that it would reward Hamas for its attack, which again the United States does not wish to do. To go back to a point that Randa makes, we've been using the term resistance in talking about Hamas in Iran, in Iran's proxies. I think a more accurate way to describe them, at least in English, would be rejectionist. They're not interested in finding common ground. They're not interested in a negotiated solution for lots of reasons. And that, of course, greatly complicates any effort to go big and bold because it's not clear who your negotiating partners are or whether you can get them to the negotiating table or that they would be at all interested in having negotiations. And so, again, we can come up with lots of bold plans. I would just say, to borrow a phrase that's often used in diplomatic circles about trying to conduct negotiations, it doesn't seem like the conditions or the time are ripe to make any progress.
Good. I promise I'll get back to Andrey and Karim before we end, but I do want to get the audience brought into the conversation. And I want to start with Dr. Abdul Khalik Abdullah, please.
Yes, thank you, Andrew. I'm right here. Hi. Very timely panel and the topic of the hour. I have two questions, both addressed to Randa and maybe the other distinguished panelists too. Picking on what you said, Randa, Iran, Hezbollah, Hamas being the winner narrative-wise, the question, who are the other winners, if any? And then, more importantly, who are the top 2, 3 losers so far? That's question number one, Andrew. Question number two, which is very quick also, hopefully, also addressed to the panelists and Randa specifically. How much of this war on Gaza is Israel war and how much is it an American war? How much is it a Netanyahu war and how much is it a Biden war? Politically and every sense of the word that you could use. Thank you very much.
Good. Randa, very quickly, if you could, please.
Andrew, can we take all the questions?
Oh, you want to take all of them?
Yeah,
okay, sure. Mr. Asad al-Shamran, please.
Thank you very much indeed. Asad al-Shamran from Prince Saud al-Faisal Institute for Diplomatic Studies in Riyadh. I thank very much all the presenters, very valuable presentations indeed. I just have a short comment. I'm conscious of the time. It seems to me that as we try to outline the future, what will happen in the future, I think we can have a glimpse of that by the way the current crisis is conceptualized. If someone, and by someone I mean a country or a commentator, starts by saying that basically the problem starts with the daring attack by Hamas on Israel on the 7th, which is now is basically the Israeli line, and that's it. That's all about it. Then I think we are into a period of, well, not only status quo to quo ante, but a period of really perpetual occupation. But on the other hand, if someone says, we condemn the atrocities against the committed against the civilians, the Israeli civilians on the 7th, as well as what happened afterwards by Israel. However, the focal point is the occupation, and the occupation should be the center of discussion. Then I think here there is a possibility of a movement forward. Now, for me, I think here the key is the United States and the major European countries, because the idea that the occupation is the central problematic in this region is accepted widely, even by countries who have peace treaties with Israel, and it's accepted worldwide. The problem is the challenge, if the US and the major European countries start saying, yes, we condemn what Hamas did, and we sympathize with Israel, etc., but the focal point, as we can see it now, is the occupation, and this has to come to an end in accordance with the framework put by the UN Security Council. That should be the term of reference.
If you could ask the question, but we're running out of time.
I'll just finish with this one. This is the term of reference, and start treating all parties in the same way that we treat all other violators, the West treat all other violators of UN Security Council resolutions, in the same way that we do not accept from Russia when they say, well, the Russians support, the Russian people support the military operation in Ukraine. We shouldn't accept the argument that just because there is a majority in Israel supports the military operation in Gaza and doesn't want to end the occupation, then we should just stand still. I think a genuine pressure should be applied by the US and by the major European countries in accordance with their declared principles. Thank you.
Nabil Fahmy, Mr. Minister.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you all for your comments. They're very interesting and useful. You seem to all be saying that if things continue as they are, they will get worse. You also seem to be agreeing that there's no real potential for a complete resolution with the present Israeli government and the present status of Hamas. That's fine, but what you didn't say is, okay, so what do we do? You started off by saying that America has to be bold, bigger and big and bold. I agree with you, but I have to take issue, not with America's support for Israel, I do, but particularly with President Biden's attendance of a war cabinet just before the operations, because then he is responsible also for the results and the excesses of the operations. But let me get back to the point at hand. There are three main issues here. And let's leave aside Hamas and the Israeli government. What do we do with Gaza? Karim correctly said, it's not going to be the same, but we don't know what to do with it. What do we do? Sorry, the first thing is the ceasefire. This is simply unacceptable to continue to kill civilians at the rate we've seen under any pretext. Second issue is hostages, and what do we do with Gaza? That's a practical issue which has to be dealt with, and which you won't get point one unless you solve that as well. And I agree with the last comment just made. The essence of the problem is occupation. So you're not going to get a complete resolution of the Gaza issue, a complete resolution of the hostage issue, without getting some indication of how does this end. In other words, do we reach a solution or not? So my question to any of you, I know it's difficult, I know it may mean change of leadership among Hamas and among the Israeli government and among some Palestinians. Is it possible to link all three of these issues? Ending the ceasefire, dealing with the hostage and and the Gaza situation, and a recommitment not to a peace conference. We're beyond peace conferences. And a commitment to an enunciated two-state solution. All the details of the two-state solution have been written up hundreds of times before. And I'll just mention one document, which has 90% of them in there, the Taba document, which is the Monartinos report. Can't that be put together as a package by the Americans, for example, with the support of some international players, and basically be put forward to the Security Council as this is what the world wants the region to do to get out of this mess? Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Nuruddin bin Tasha.
Nuruddin bin Tisha, shukran.
Thank you.
شكرا على
Thank you very much for this valuable presentations and this analysis about the situation in Gaza. And you agree all that there should be a solution, and this solution can be only political. And my question is the following. Before talking about that, I think that we are far away from the solution because the political solutions come through negotiations after the end of wars. And we have to talk about the transition through which the negotiators could have some rapprochement and find a solution. And in this regard, I ask the following question to Mr. Zaid in particular. And based on the fact that we are talking about all the policies in a new era, do you think that the reformulation of the Madrid Accords and Oslo Accords with the same leaders of the past and with the same old mechanisms, with the same old players, do you think this way can we find an exit? And this exit cannot be definite or realistic. Can we have such an exit that could make us away from the ghost of war another time in the coming years till the humanity finds new mechanisms to resolve the conflicts?
I'd like to go quickly, really quickly to the panelists. We've got 2 minutes. For lunch, but we had so many good questions. But please, very briefly, winners and losers, Israel war versus US war. Can we put all the pieces together in terms of what Foreign Minister Fahmy said in terms of bringing this together? And then the last question, are the mechanisms and systems available to move beyond what we have? So Randa, let me start with you again very quickly, but all good questions and everyone gets a shot at them.
Quickly, I don't believe that you have winners in war. I mean, you have relatively parties that improve their position vis-a-vis the others. The top losers are the Palestinians. And I'm making distinction between Hamas as an entity, which can survive, which can win only by surviving. The top losers are the Palestinians. Today we have 1.7 million Gazans who, out of 2.2 million, who according to Israeli cabinet reports can no longer live in their own homes. And we don't know if they will ever go back to their home. They are the top losers. The second tier of losers are, on one hand, Netanyahu himself. I think his political future will be decided by an investigation committee, but we can say that he has presided over a colossal intelligence military failure, and he's going to take responsibility for that. And the second loser also is the Palestinian Authority. Again, I mean, its recipe for resolution of the conflict, for standing up for the rights of the Palestinians, has really taken a huge blow, and increasingly is becoming across as less of a representative of the Palestinians than, for example, Hamas. And finally, I would say the US is a loser in this, I think, which answers the second question that Dr. Abdullah has asked me. President Biden owns this war. He owns Israel's war in Gaza by giving unconditional support to Israel from the get-go, by continuing to refuse to go for a ceasefire. It's likely this rejection of a ceasefire is not going to be resolved anytime soon within the Biden administration. I think both of this make US complicit in whatever Israel, in terms of the carnage, in terms of the violation of the international order, in terms of the double system, our standing or our coming across as having double standards in terms of international humanitarian law, not caring about Palestinian death and Palestinian lives. So in that respect, I think the US is also elusive.
Karim, would you like to pick up on Foreign Minister Fahmi's question about how do you envision the three pieces being woven together, and is that possible?
Yes, thank you. A quick point before we address Minister Fahmi's question. On the US position, I think, in a word, it is untenable, meaning that we either have movement on the US position calling for a ceasefire, hopefully sometime soon, or the United States has to contend with very serious implications for its posture in the region and perhaps even direct threats to its interests. One of these two things has to give. On Minister Fahmi's question, I think that the point of departure has to be a real recognition that we are not just in another regional crisis. I think we are really at a regional turning point. I like the way Lindsay framed it as sort of another 1914 Sarajevo moment. I think we are at that moment. Ideally, I think to address the very serious implications we've all been talking about, there needs to be a sense of urgency and there needs to be a sense of real commitment on two tracks. First, I think there needs to be a real diplomatic mobilization on de-escalation. I think the vulnerabilities with which all sides come out from this conflict, Palestinians, Israelis, Iranians, players like Hezbollah, this crisis is really revealing acute vulnerabilities that potentially lead to escalation and possibly preemption. So I think there needs to be a very intense mobilization and diplomatic heavy lifting on the de-escalation track. Secondly, yes, the two-state solution, I think Minister Fahmi is absolutely correct. I think what we need is not another conference. What we need is a credible roadmap with buy-in from the United States and the international community, but also the regional actors, a roadmap that takes us from where we are to a clear, credible, viable two-state solution. Lindsay is right, it will not happen today or tomorrow, but we have to find a way to revive the horizon for a two-state solution. If we don't do that, yes, it's difficult to negotiate this with Hamas, but the alternative that has always been there in the form of the Palestinian Authority has been severely undermined. The only way to combat Hamas's narrative is to revive the horizon for peace. Gaza has to be an integral part of that, and that means dealing with all of the complications that we mentioned in terms of the outcome of this war in Gaza. But Gaza is one piece, and it has to be addressed holistically in the context of the two-state solution. Gaza and the West Bank are or should be considered one territorial unit. Dealing with the Gaza piece alone, I think, sets us up for more complications down the road. We either do these things or we are left living with this perpetual Sarajevo moment, right? Setting us up for either a big regional explosion or a series of explosions that will make all of our lives extremely complicated.
Zaid, if you want to pick up on the question asked for you.
Yeah, sure. Noordin, I think. No, I don't think we have to redo the same mechanisms. They're going to fail. But I'm going to mind you two things. The Arabs the collective Arabs, in particular Palestinians, are much worse off today than they used to be back in 1993. And actually, Arabs are much more weaker today than they were back in 1993, 1991, 93. So Madrid 1 and Madrid 2, and Oslo 1. And therefore, whatever conclusions to be reached in these possible conferences will reflect definitely the balance of power. And that takes me immediately to Your Excellency's point. I think your 3 points are definitely linked together, and that what actually makes the ceasefire is problematic in its own, because there's no agreement on what needs to be done and how to be done for whom and who does what. But in all cases, the two-state solution might be restored, definitely not the two-state solutions that Taba talked about. Thank you.
Very good. Andrey, let me ask you and reframe Dr. Abdul Khalek's question this way. Does Russia, in your view, come out a winner or a loser in this conflict?
As I said, I don't think that there are any strategic winners in this conflict. And let me say that, of course, the current geopolitical competition between great powers casts a shadow on the situation in the region, and for me it is very difficult to imagine that we can resurrect the Middle East Quartet from its grave. It would probably be a good idea to get back to some kind of multilateral arrangement between major powers, but I don't think it will happen anytime soon. However, that might imply an opportunity for other players, including players in the region. It might be the Arab League, it might be GCC, it might be other actors from the global south. It might be an opportunity for them to come with the kind of a roadmap that we discussed here. And even if great powers are reluctant to accept this roadmap in full, even if the United States or Russia or whoever continues to veto drafts of the UN Security Council resolution, it's important to keep the process going. I think that, of course, the immediate goal, quick fixes if you wish, is to go for de-escalation. But in the end of the day, we have to get back to the vision of a sustainable two-state solution. I don't think that there is any other way, and I do hope that in the region there'll be more energy and more enthusiasm to come up with more specific roadmaps.
Jim, a final word on U.S. policy toward the conflict, and as Randa said, President Biden's ownership of it.
Andrew, so much to say, so little time to say it.
Very little time.
So my apologies to the interpreters. Let me just say, I don't think it can be fairly described that this is a U.S. war or a Biden war. This is the last thing the administration wanted. I think the Biden administration regards what happened in the same way that Dr. Gargash mentioned in his opening remarks today, as a profound setback to what had been positive developments in the region, positive for growth and prosperity in the region, but also positive for America's own interests, because again, the backdrop is the United States has wanted to lower its involvement, commitment, and presence in the Middle East. I think any president would have thrown his support or her support behind Israel, so I don't think it matters what venue he did. I think the narrative, as you see it today, would have broken down exactly on the same lines that it has. I do think it's very important as we have this conversation and we talk about civilian casualties in Gaza that we not lose sight of the fact that a major reason for it is because of Hamas co-locating among civilians, using civilians as human shields, and I don't think Hamas can be given a free pass in that. In many respects, Hamas's policy is to maximize the deaths of Palestinians, to sort of reaffirm this notion of resistance in martyrdom. And while I do think that Israelis, in my view, need to find legitimate ways or ways to address legitimate aspirations of the Palestinian people for their own nation, for a two-state solution, I think we have to confront a question that any Israeli who is open to a two-state solution is bound to ask, who are we to negotiate with? And how confident can we be? Why should we be confident that they can actually deliver the peace that we all want? And I go back to Randa's point, which is if Hamas is going to become the only sort of interlocutor for the Israelis, I do not know how we go forward, because I cannot imagine an Israeli government that is willing to sit down and negotiate with Hamas. I know you could offer up the Palestinian Authority, but again, I think even for any Palestinians, doubt the effectiveness, in honesty, incompetence of the Palestinian Authority. So then the question becomes, who speaks for the many Palestinians who simply want to have the ability to live a secure, peaceful, prosperous life? Last thing is, many of these conversations seem to have an implicit theme or assumption that the United States can somehow dictate outcomes if only it chooses to do so. I can simply say from the vantage point of the United States, if only that were true, life would be so much easier. The reality in all of these contexts is even if the United States is the most powerful country or the more powerful country, other countries have agency. Weak countries have agency. And that's always the great challenge to conduct any successful foreign policy, is that getting your friends to go along can be as challenging as getting your adversaries to come to terms. I ran too long, I apologize.
Thank you. And thank you, Dr. Ebtissam, for giving us more time for this rich discussion. This was a fantastic conversation, superb analysis. I think that met the high standards of the Abu Dhabi strategic debate on a very important issue. Thank you to the panelists. Thank you to the audience. And lunch is served.